The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of San Diego. The neighborhood, nestled between the glistening Pacific Ocean and the rugged hills of California, appeared as idyllic as a postcard. The homes were large, elegant, and meticulously maintained, the kind of place where success and comfort were evident in every detail. In one of these homes, the Walters family lived, seemingly untouched by the imperfections that plagued so many others. David Walters, a tall, well-groomed businessman in his early 40s, stood by the large bay window of his sprawling living room, staring out at the manicured lawn. His reflection in the glass was sharp and polished, much like the life he had built for himself and his family. A successful tech entrepreneur, David had everything he could ever want: wealth, respect, and a picture-perfect family. His wife, Emily, was the embodiment of grace, dedicated to raising their two children, Olivia and Lucas, while maintaining their home with an unwavering devotion. They were the model of a successful American family. They were happy. Or at least, that's what David told himself every day. The house was pristine, its walls lined with family portraits that smiled down on the perfect family. Olivia, their 15-year-old daughter, was in the living room, practicing the piano as Lucas, their 12-year-old son, played with his video games in the corner. Emily was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner, the smell of roasted chicken and vegetables filling the air. It was a typical evening in the Walters household, a snapshot of suburban bliss. Yet beneath the surface, something dark and dangerous simmered, waiting to surface. As Emily set the table for dinner, her mind wandered, a familiar unease settling in her chest. Something had felt off lately. David, who once arrived home at the same time every night, had begun staying later at the office, always claiming he had urgent meetings or last-minute projects. The sudden distance between them, though subtle at first, was growing too hard to ignore. Emily had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, her gut told her something wasn't right. But she refused to believe it. After all, David had always been the perfect husband, hadn't he? He'd given her everything she ever wanted: a beautiful home, a comfortable life, and two wonderful children. She had no reason to question his loyalty. Or so she thought. The idea that her perfect husband could betray her seemed almost too absurd to entertain. Meanwhile, across the room, Sophia moved quietly in the background, polishing the fine china in preparation for the meal. Hired just a year ago, she had quickly become an integral part of the household. A young, striking woman with dark hair and a quiet demeanor, Sophia was everything Emily had hoped for in a maid. She was efficient, polite, and always willing to help. Emily trusted her completely, grateful for the extra set of hands. Yet, beneath that quiet exterior, there was a hunger for something more. Sophia had come from a small town in Northern California, seeking a fresh start in the big city. But what she had found in San Diego wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to escape her modest beginnings and grasp at the wealth and power she had long dreamed of. And David Walters, with his sharp suits and impeccable charm, seemed to be her golden ticket. She wasn't looking for love. No, she had a much more calculated goal in mind. She wanted to climb the social ladder, to surround herself with wealth and influence. David, with his successful career and his trusting wife, was the perfect stepping stone. And she was willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. It started innocently enough. A few exchanged glances in the kitchen as Sophia prepared meals, a few compliments from David about her work. But those simple exchanges soon escalated into something much more dangerous. A hand brushing against hers as she passed him a dish, a lingering touch on the small of her back when she bent down to pick something up. It was all so subtle at first, but there was no mistaking the spark that had ignited between them. David never planned for it to happen. He loved Emily. He adored their children. But somewhere along the way, he found himself drawn to Sophia, her youth and energy pulling him in like a magnet. He felt alive again in a way he hadn't in years. The thrill of it was intoxicating, but it also made him feel guilty, guilty for betraying Emily, guilty for risking everything he had worked so hard for. But despite the guilt, he couldn't stop himself. Sophia knew what she was doing. She knew exactly how to play David's insecurities, his need for excitement, his desire to escape the monotonous routine of family life. Each compliment, each moment of closeness, brought them closer together, until the lines between loyalty and desire began to blur. The affair, though still secret, was beginning to take shape. David found himself lying to Emily more frequently, leaving work early to meet Sophia in the quiet, empty house. He would cancel dinner plans, claim to be stuck at the office, and when he came home, he'd be distant, preoccupied with thoughts of the forbidden meetings. Each stolen moment, each touch, each kiss felt like a dangerous game, a game that had no clear rules, no clear winner. As the evening wore on and the family gathered around the dinner table, the tension hung in the air, unnoticed by Emily, but ever present for David. What had once been a picture-perfect life was now beginning to crack at the seams. The lies, the guilt, the excitement, it was all building to something inevitable. But David couldn't see it yet. He didn't know that the web he had woven would soon entangle everyone, pulling them all into a darkness none of them could escape. The perfect family, the perfect life, was about to shatter. It wasn't long before the subtle tension that had been building between David and Sophia began to consume them both. Each fleeting touch, each stolen glance, seemed to create an insatiable hunger that neither of them could ignore. At first, it had all seemed harmless enough, just a few polite words exchanged in passing, a brief moment of shared laughter. But something darker had begun to take root in the quiet moments they spent together. David couldn't help but feel an undeniable pull toward Sophia. She was everything that Emily was not, young, vibrant, full of life, and most importantly, she made him feel desired in a way he hadn't in years. It wasn't just her beauty, it was her energy, her enthusiasm for life, something that had become foreign to him in his marriage. Emily had become the caretaker, the mother, the partner who was always focused on the family, always looking out for everyone else. She was the steady presence in his life, but somewhere along the way, that steadiness had become mundane, suffocating even. He longed for excitement, something to remind him of who he used to be, the man who once took risks, who once lived for the thrill of the unknown. Sophia, on the other hand, understood exactly what she was doing. She knew how to make David feel special. She listened to him with rapt attention, praised him for his achievements, and subtly made him feel as though he were the center of her world. It wasn't love, it was manipulation, but David was too blinded by desire to see it. Every compliment, every moment of intimacy they shared fueled the fire inside him, and soon it wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional too. He felt a connection to Sophia, a connection he had convinced himself was real, even though deep down, he knew it was built on lies. But the guilt lingered in the back of his mind. David loved Emily. He loved their children. Emily had been his rock for over a decade. They had built a life together, one that many would envy, but it wasn't enough anymore. Each time he kissed Sophia, each time he slipped away from his family for one of their secret rendezvous, he could feel the weight of his betrayal hanging over him. He would tell himself that it wasn't permanent, that it was just a temporary escape, something to break the monotony. But deep down, he knew this was more than just a fleeting affair, it was the beginning of something that could tear his entire world apart. One evening, while Emily was busy in the kitchen preparing dinner, David and Sophia found themselves alone in the living room. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made everything feel amplified. They exchanged a glance, one that held more meaning than either of them would admit. David could feel his heart race, the anticipation of what was about to unfold filling the air between them. He knew it was wrong, every fiber of his being screamed that it was a mistake, but he couldn't stop himself. Sophia stepped closer, her breath warm against his cheek. "You've been so distant lately," she whispered, her voice low and seductive. "You deserve more than what you have at home." The words struck a chord deep within David. He felt torn. Emily was a good wife, a devoted mother, and yet, something was missing. He had always believed that their love was unshakable, but in the quiet moments when he looked at Sophia, the spark of something different, something exciting, surged within him. "I'm not happy," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's happening with me. I love Emily, but I don't feel the same anymore. I feel trapped." Sophia's eyes glinted with understanding, her smile widening as she gently cupped his face in her hands. "You don't have to stay trapped, David. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to live a life where you can feel alive again." Her words were poison, sweetly laced with promises of a future that only she could offer, a life of freedom, excitement, and passion. For a brief moment, David allowed himself to imagine that future. He could picture himself living with Sophia, away from the responsibilities and expectations of his family. It seemed so much simpler, so much easier than the life he had built with Emily. But even as the thought crossed his mind, the weight of his family's needs and expectations pressed down on him. He thought of Emily, of her love for him, her devotion, her trust. And in that moment, guilt crashed over him like a wave, reminding him of everything he stood to lose. The battle raged inside him, desire and guilt, passion and loyalty, each force pulling him in different directions. Sophia could see the hesitation in his eyes. She had anticipated this moment, had known that David would falter. But she also knew how to push him further, to make him believe that his happiness depended on her. "You deserve more than this life," she continued, her voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to keep pretending. I can give you everything you've been missing." David's breath quickened, and for a moment, he was lost in her gaze, in the promise of something new, something intoxicating. He leaned in, kissing her with a fervor that surprised even himself. It wasn't just physical, it was a desperate need to feel something, anything, that could break the chains of his mundane existence. After the kiss, Sophia pulled back slightly, her fingers trailing down his chest. "You need to make a choice, David," she said, her voice serious now. "We can have a life together, but only if you're willing to leave it all behind, the family, the responsibilities, the lies." David's heart raced, his mind spinning. The choice was so much bigger than he had ever imagined. Could he really leave everything he had built with Emily? Could he betray the family he had promised to protect? And yet, the thought of the life Sophia promised him, the thrill, the adventure, made it all seem so tempting. For the first time, David realized that his affair with Sophia was no longer just about passion, it was about escape. Escape from the life he had outgrown, from the man he had become. And though he knew the consequences would be devastating, a part of him wondered if it would be worth it. If he could finally feel free again. But somewhere deep down, he also knew this affair could never end well. The guilt gnawed at him, but the desire to break free was overpowering. And as he gazed at Sophia, the choice seemed clearer than ever. This wasn't just an affair anymore, it was the beginning of a dangerous game. One that David had already started, and there was no turning back. The days that followed David's encounter with Sophia were filled with a strange sense of anticipation, mixed with an ever-growing unease that gnawed at his insides. It wasn't the same anymore. The distance between him and Emily had widened, not just physically, but emotionally. Every time he looked at her, a flood of guilt surged within him, yet there was something else, something deeper, that lingered, like a shadow he couldn't escape. Emily had noticed the change. At first, it was subtle, small enough to ignore, but over time, the signs became impossible to overlook. David's increasing lateness, his distracted demeanor, and the way he seemed to withdraw into himself when he was home, all of it spoke volumes. But what unsettled her the most was the way Sophia had begun acting. Sophia had always been the model employee, polite, efficient, and respectful. But in recent weeks, Emily had noticed a change in her as well. She no longer greeted Emily with the same warmth she once did. There was an air of reserve about her now, a guardedness that seemed out of place for someone who had once been so eager to please. Their conversations had become stilted, with Sophia offering only brief responses, her gaze often avoiding Emily's eyes. It wasn't overt, but Emily could feel it, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. One afternoon, Emily was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she caught a glimpse of Sophia in the hallway. For a moment, their eyes met, and Emily saw something in Sophia's gaze that made her skin crawl, a knowing look, a look that seemed to say everything, and yet nothing at all. It was fleeting, but it left Emily unsettled. The hair on the back of her neck prickled, and for the first time, she began to question the trust she had placed in the young woman. David had always been good at hiding his emotions, but recently, Emily began to notice cracks in his facade. When he came home, he would retreat to his office, avoiding conversation. The small talks they used to share over dinner had become rare, and the affection that once flowed freely between them had all but disappeared. He spent more time on his phone, often leaving the room to take calls that he wouldn't discuss. Each excuse he gave for his late nights at work felt more rehearsed, more hollow than the last. Emily's instincts, honed over years of marriage, told her something was off. At first, she had chalked it up to the pressures of his job, the constant demands of his career. But the more she observed him, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on, something that didn't involve work at all. It wasn't just the late nights or the hidden phone calls, it was his sudden disinterest in their life together. His disconnection was becoming too apparent to ignore. One evening, as she was preparing to make dinner, Emily found herself staring at David, who was sitting in the living room, his face buried in his phone. His usual evening routine of asking about her day and engaging with their children had been replaced with an eerie silence. He looked up for a moment and met her eyes, but it was fleeting. The familiar spark in his eyes, the warmth, was gone. In its place was a cold detachment that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "Are you all right?" Emily asked, trying to break the silence. Her voice felt foreign, as if she were trying to reconnect with someone who had already drifted too far away. David paused, as if her question had taken him by surprise. He set his phone down and gave her a forced smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just tired," he said, his voice distant. "Work's been crazy. You know how it is." Emily nodded, but she didn't believe him. She could see it in his face, he was lying. She didn't know why, but every fiber of her being screamed that something was wrong. It wasn't long before she noticed other signs, things that seemed out of place. One night, she was tidying up the bedroom when she found a receipt for a hotel reservation, one that David had made for a weekend getaway. At first, Emily thought it might be for a work trip, but then she saw the date, October 20th, the same weekend their family was supposed to visit her parents in the mountains. David had told her he had to work late that weekend, but now she was certain he hadn't. He had lied. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Emily still couldn't bring herself to believe what her instincts were telling her. She had to know the truth. The idea that her husband, the man she had built a life with, could betray her was something she couldn't comprehend. But deep down, she feared she was only seeing what was already there. One evening, as she sat in the living room, Emily saw Sophia and David together. They were standing close to one another, their bodies angled toward each other as they spoke. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she watched the way they interacted, the way they stood just a little too close. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. She quickly averted her gaze, not wanting them to know she had witnessed it, but the image was seared into her mind. The closeness, the shared laughter, everything about it screamed of something more than just an employee and her employer. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside David, Emily replayed the scene over and over in her head. Her chest tightened, and the familiar weight of dread settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing him, that something had already slipped through her fingers, and she didn't know how to stop it. David had always been her anchor, her partner in everything, but now he seemed like a stranger. His absence in their home was palpable, like a hole in the fabric of their life together. Emily didn't know how much longer she could pretend that everything was fine. And then, one night, after another long day of distance, David came home late, his car's headlights cutting through the dark driveway like a signal of impending doom. Emily stood by the window, staring out into the night, her mind a whirlpool of suspicions. She had already begun to wonder what she would do if the worst were true, if David was no longer the man she had married. The quiet click of the door opening broke her reverie. David was home. But this time, Emily wasn't going to wait for the truth to come to her. She had to confront him, before it was too late. The air in the Walters household was thick with tension. Every room felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode at any moment. Emily had been living in a constant state of dread, each day dragging on longer than the last. David's behavior was no longer just an occasional misstep, it was now a pattern she couldn't ignore. His increasing detachment, his late nights, and the growing distance between them had begun to erode the foundation of their once solid marriage. Despite the growing evidence, Emily had not confronted him yet. She couldn't bring herself to. It was as if the very idea of betrayal was something she couldn't even process. But every instinct inside her screamed that something was terribly wrong. And then, there was Sophia. The house felt smaller and smaller with each passing day. The silent exchanges between Sophia and David, the way their eyes would linger just a little too long when Emily was out of the room, had become undeniable. Emily could no longer pretend that these moments were just innocent. Her worst fears had been confirmed in fragments of stolen glances, brief touches, and the unnatural coldness between her and David whenever Sophia was around. She wasn't imagining it. There was something more than just a working relationship between them. One evening, as Emily set the dinner table, she felt a sharp, unsettling ache in her chest. She had been pretending for weeks now, putting on the facade of the perfect wife, of the woman who had everything under control, but it was all falling apart. David was slipping away, and she could feel the walls closing in on her. She could see it now, the cracks in their marriage had deepened, and she was helpless to stop the inevitable. "David," she called out, her voice steady but laced with an edge of desperation. "We need to talk." He had just come in from the office, his tired eyes instantly avoiding hers. He shrugged off his jacket and hung it up, but not before shooting a glance at Sophia, who was standing in the doorway, as usual, far too close. Emily felt the weight of that glance like a slap. Sophia was never far from David, a constant presence, even when she wasn't needed. It was suffocating. David turned his gaze back to Emily, the hint of a defensive smile playing on his lips, as though he was trying to mask the growing anxiety beneath. "Not now, Em. I'm exhausted. Let's just eat, okay?" But Emily wasn't going to let it slide anymore. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, the words that had been stuck in her throat for days now spilling out in a rush. "No, David. We have to talk. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when I know it's not. I know something's going on." He froze, his hand halfway to the door, the color draining from his face. He could feel the sudden shift in the air between them. Emily was no longer the wife who would quietly forgive, who would let the small things slide. She was demanding the truth, and for the first time, David wasn't sure if he could lie to her anymore. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his voice low, defensive. "You're overreacting." But Emily wasn't fooled. She could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. It was the same look he had whenever she caught him in a lie, whenever he was trying to dodge the truth. Her suspicions had become undeniable, but there was something else now, a cold clarity in her mind. She wasn't asking for answers anymore. She was demanding them. "You think I'm overreacting?" Emily's voice grew stronger, her frustration rising. I've seen how you've been acting, how you've been pulling away from me, how you've been hiding things from me. I found the hotel receipt, David. You told me you were working, but you were at a hotel, with her. She took a step closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. You've been lying to me, and I deserve the truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. David's face was ashen now, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for an escape, but he had no words. The truth was out in the open, hanging between them like a thick fog. Emily, please, just let me explain, he began, but his voice faltered as he saw the fire in her eyes, the pain, the rawness. She was no longer the woman who would excuse him. The woman who would swallow her doubts and turn the other cheek. She was done pretending. Explain? Emily's laugh was bitter, harsh. Explain what, David? That I'm imagining things? That you're not having an affair with Sophia? The words hit like a punch to his gut, and for the first time, David didn't try to deny it. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. His eyes darted to Sophia, who stood just behind him, her face passive, but Emily could see the faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips. I've seen the way you look at her, Emily continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. I'm not blind, David. And I can't keep pretending that I don't see what's happening right in front of me. David felt his throat tighten as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He couldn't look Emily in the eye. He couldn't bear the shame that flooded him. The betrayal was real, and it had finally come to light. He had made a choice, and now that choice was staring him in the face. I don't know what to say, David stammered, his voice barely audible. His heart was pounding, but not from guilt, there was a sickening realization that it was too late to take it all back. Emily had seen everything, and the walls he had built around his lies were crumbling. You don't have to say anything anymore, David, Emily whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I don't think I want to hear it. I want you to leave. Now. His face twisted in disbelief. What? You want me to leave? Yes, Emily said firmly, her voice gaining strength. I can't do this anymore. I won't live a lie, David. You can leave, and you can figure out your life with her. But I won't be part of it. For a moment, David just stood there, his mind racing. He had expected everything, anger, frustration, even tears, but never this calm finality. Emily had made her decision. And it wasn't him. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy as he walked out of the house. Sophia stood there, watching him go, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips, but Emily didn't see her. Her world had just shattered, but in that moment, she finally understood. It was over. The life she had fought for was no longer hers to hold. The silence in the house was deafening. Emily stood motionless in the living room, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. David had left. He had walked out the door without another word, without a fight. He had abandoned her, abandoned their family, and she was left standing there in the aftermath of everything they had built. Her heart was racing, and yet, beneath the shock and pain, there was something else, something almost liberating. She had made a decision. She had finally taken control. But it came at a cost, and the weight of that cost began to sink in as the reality of the situation set in. Sophia had remained in the background during the confrontation, a silent observer, her face blank. But Emily could see the smug satisfaction in her eyes. Sophia wasn't surprised by her actions. She had been playing this game all along, carefully manipulating David and waiting for the moment when he would finally choose her. And now, Emily's worst fear was confirmed. Sophia was not just the maid in their home, she had become the woman who had torn it apart. Emily didn't look at her. She couldn't. Instead, she turned, her hands clenched at her sides, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. Her mind raced, replaying everything, the late nights, the the excuses, the lies. It was all clear now. She had been living a lie, but now it was out in the open. The pieces had all come together in one painful, crushing realization. David had been having an affair with Sophia, and Emily had been blind to it. Worse, she had ignored the warning signs because she didn't want to face the truth. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, a deep, aching void that seemed to consume her from the inside out. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The life she had worked so hard to build, the family she had sacrificed everything for, was crumbling in front of her eyes. She was alone now, alone with her thoughts, her anger, and the shattered pieces of a once perfect life. But as the silence stretched on, Emily's resolve began to harden. She was not going to let this define her. She had given David everything, her trust, her love, her loyalty, and he had thrown it all away for Sophia. She would not let his actions destroy her. Emily had always been the glue that held their family together, and she would continue to hold strong. She had to. For Olivia, for Lucas, and for herself. As if on cue, the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the silence. Emily turned sharply, her eyes locking onto Sophia, who was now standing in the doorway, watching her with a cool, calculating expression. There was no hint of regret, no shame in her gaze, just a quiet, cold confidence that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "You've won, then," Emily said, her voice low but steady. It was the only thing she could say, the only thing that made sense. She wasn't angry at Sophia, no, her anger was reserved for David. But there was something about Sophia's smugness that made her blood boil. Sophia had known all along, and now she was standing there, victorious, as if she had conquered some great prize. Sophia's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it, just a cold, calculated satisfaction. "I didn't want this, Emily," she said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "But David, he's a man, and men get bored. He needed someone who could give him the excitement he was craving." The words cut through Emily like a knife. The audacity of this woman, how could she be so cold, so ruthless? Emily's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stepped forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "You think this is all a game?" Emily asked, her voice rising with emotion. "You think you can just waltz in and destroy my family, my life, and walk away with no consequences? Well, you're wrong. This is my life, and I'm not going to stand by and let you tear it apart." Sophia's smile faded slightly, but she didn't back down. "You never noticed, did you? The way he looked at me, the way he wanted me. You were too busy being the perfect wife, the perfect mother. Too busy with your own little world to see that he was falling for me." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut, but she didn't flinch. She was done playing the victim. Sophia wanted to provoke her, but Emily refused to let her. "You think you can take everything from me, Sophia?" Emily said, her voice ice cold. "You think you can walk away with him, and he'll just forget everything we've had? You're wrong. You're just a distraction. You'll never be the woman David thought I was. You'll never be the family I built. And you'll never be me." There was a long pause, the air thick with tension. For a moment, Emily wasn't sure if Sophia would lash out, but instead, Sophia simply tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Emily," Sophia said softly, her tone almost sympathetic. "You gave up on David long before I came into the picture. You didn't see it, but I did. I saw the cracks in your perfect life. I saw him yearning for something more." Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. Sophia's words, while cruel, were nothing more than an attempt to justify her actions. Emily knew the truth. David had chosen his own path, and Sophia was nothing more than the manifestation of his weakness. She wasn't the cause of the destruction, it had started long before Sophia came into the picture. With one final, piercing look at Sophia, Emily turned and walked toward the door. She wasn't going to waste another second of her life on someone who had already chosen his fate. There was nothing left for her here. As she opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, Emily finally felt the weight lift from her chest. It wasn't over, but it was a beginning. A beginning of something she hadn't known she needed: freedom. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Emily stood alone in the quiet, uncertain night, ready to start over. No more lies. No more compromises. From now on, she would fight for herself. She would fight for her children. And most importantly, she would never allow herself to be blindsided again. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur of confusion, anger, and a relentless sense of betrayal. Emily had left David, her heart heavy with the knowledge of his infidelity, but also resolute in her decision to reclaim her life. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. It echoed with the ghosts of what had been, a life she no longer recognized, a marriage she could no longer trust. But as the dust began to settle, Emily realized that the worst was still ahead. David, though seemingly absent, had not disappeared from her life. He had called, texted, and even visited, but Emily knew that what was at stake now was more than just a marriage, it was the truth of their entire existence together. He couldn't just walk away from what he had done. And Emily wasn't going to let him pretend as if everything could be swept under the rug. As the days wore on, Sophia's presence in their home became even more pronounced. The line between housemaid and lover had blurred, and Emily could feel it. Sophia was no longer just a shadow in the background. She was bold, confident, and had no intention of hiding her role in David's life. The thought of Sophia walking around with that smirk on her face, acting as if she had won, only deepened Emily's resolve to protect what was left of her dignity, her family. David's behavior had become more erratic. The guilt, which had once kept him silent, now made him desperate. He began pleading with Emily, asking for forgiveness, promising to change, telling her that Sophia had only been a fleeting mistake, a phase he regretted. But Emily couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more to the story than he was willing to admit. Sophia had not only infiltrated their home but had carefully woven a web of lies around David, manipulating him in ways Emily had never imagined. The truth was uglier than anything Emily had expected, and it was clear that David was no longer the man she had married. Emily's suspicions grew stronger when she overheard a conversation between David and Sophia one evening. She had been sitting upstairs in her bedroom, the door ajar, when she heard David's voice, tight with frustration. "We can't keep doing this, Sophia." David's voice was low, filled with a sense of desperation. "I can't keep lying to her. I don't want to lose my family." Emily's heart dropped as she crept closer to the door. She wanted to hear more, needed to know how far the manipulation had gone. Sophia's response was calm, too calm. "You don't have a choice, David. You've already made your decision. You can't go back now. If you back out, it'll all fall apart. You're in too deep." Her voice was smooth, persuasive, almost soothing, like a snake wrapping itself around David's neck. "I can't leave her, Sophia. I don't want to hurt the kids." "You already have," Sophia interjected, her tone almost mocking. "But think about it, David, your life with Emily has become a prison. You deserve to be happy. You deserve someone who understands you. Someone who knows what you need." David's voice cracked. "I never meant for it to get this far. I thought it was just a distraction." Sophia's laughter was soft but dangerous. "That's the problem, David. You've always seen me as a distraction. But I'm not. You and we're the real thing. And if you keep backing out now, it will be the end of everything you've worked for." The coldness of her words hit Emily like a slap. It wasn't just an affair, it wasn't just an emotional mistake. It was manipulation, a calculated plan to break David, to strip him of everything he had, until he was nothing but a puppet on Sophia's strings. And now, the strings had tightened, and David was beginning to unravel. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away from the door. The realization hit her like a freight train. Sophia wasn't just trying to take her place in David's life, she was systematically dismantling their family, one lie at a time. It was never about love. It was about control. Sophia had known exactly what to say, how to manipulate David's insecurities, how to exploit his need for excitement. She was feeding off his weakness, using him like a pawn in a game that would ultimately end in destruction. David's confession, the words he had just uttered, full of guilt and regret, suddenly felt hollow. It wasn't just about his affair with Sophia anymore. It was about his total loss of agency, his complete surrender to her manipulation. And Emily realized with sudden clarity that she couldn't allow this to continue, not for him, not for her children, and not for the life they had once shared. That night, as the house settled into an uneasy silence, Emily made her decision. She couldn't just wait for things to fall apart. She had to act. Sophia was not just the other woman, she was the orchestrator of this entire disaster. And she needed to be stopped. The following morning, Emily approached David with a calm determination. His remorse was evident, but it was too little, too late. Emily had seen the strings being pulled, by Sophia, by the lies, by the twisted sense of loyalty David still clung to. And she knew that no amount of apologizing could fix what had been broken. "I'm done, David," Emily said, her voice steady, even as her insides trembled. "I've seen enough. I know what you and Sophia have been doing. And I won't let you drag me into this any longer. It's over." David's face paled, his lips trembling. "Emily, please, just let me explain." "No," she cut him off, her eyes unwavering. "You've had your chance. And you've blown it." The finality in her voice seemed to sink in. David looked defeated, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions finally caught up to him. But Emily wasn't finished. She needed to make sure this wasn't just about David. Sophia had to be held accountable too. "I'll be moving out with the kids," Emily added, her voice firm. "And when you come to your senses, when you realize what you've lost, you'll have to live with that. But not with me. Not anymore." David's eyes widened in shock, but Emily didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and walked away, knowing that what lay ahead would be difficult, but necessary. She had made her choice. And now, David would have to face the consequences of his own decisions, manipulated by Sophia into a life of deceit and betrayal. In this section, the depth of Sophia's manipulation becomes clear, revealing her calculated control over David. Emily's realization of the full extent of the betrayal strengthens her resolve, and the decision to confront both David and Sophia signals the beginning of her reclaiming control over her life. The tension continues to build, and the stage is set for the final unraveling of everything that had once been. The next few days were a whirlwind for Emily. After confronting David, she packed up the children's things, made arrangements to leave their home, and began planning her future. It felt surreal, like she was watching her life unfold from a distance. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now seemed empty, cold, and full of echoes. Every corner of the place reminded her of the life she thought she had, the family she believed in, and the trust she had placed in a man who had broken it all. She wasn't naive, she knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The emotional toll had already been immense. She had spent years building her life around David, believing in their partnership, in their family, in the dream of a perfect future together. And now, in the blink of an eye, it had all unraveled. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she had imagined, but as the pain began to subside, she realized that something had shifted inside her. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was taking back control of her life. She had made the hard decision to protect her children and herself, and that was a victory in itself. The day she left, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already seen the man David had become, and she knew that there was no going back for them. He had chosen Sophia over his family, over his own children, and he would have to live with that choice. Emily, on the other hand, had chosen herself. It wasn't a decision made out of anger, but out of necessity. She had no more room in her life for lies, for betrayal, or for anyone who would put her family at risk for their own selfish desires. David tried to reach out to her several times, his messages full of apologies, regret, and pleas for another chance. But Emily didn't respond. She knew that the words meant nothing. It was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future without him, a future where she could be happy, independent, and free of the toxic hold he and Sophia had tried to impose on her. Meanwhile, Sophia wasn't so easily dismissible. The days following Emily's departure were a mix of triumph and anxiety for her. She had gotten what she wanted, David was hers, or so she thought. She had believed that once Emily was out of the picture, her new life with David would begin, a life free from the responsibilities and confines of family. But what she hadn't anticipated was the deep-rooted complications that would arise from her manipulation. David, though he had followed her lead, wasn't the confident, decisive man she had thought him to be. He was fragile, lost in guilt and self-loathing. His decision to break up his family, to betray his children, weighed heavily on him. Sophia's influence, though strong, couldn't erase the remnants of his former life, the love he had for Emily, the bond with his kids, the memories that haunted him at night. Sophia, ever the opportunist, saw David's doubts as a weakness, and it frustrated her. She had spent so much time seducing him, manipulating him into believing that he deserved a fresh start, but now she was dealing with the fallout of his guilt. David's emotional turmoil was no longer something she could control with sweet words and empty promises. She realized, too late, that her victory had come at a great cost. It wasn't long before the truth came crashing down on both of them. The lies, the manipulations, the secrets, they couldn't stay hidden forever. Emily, despite walking away from the situation, had set the wheels of justice in motion. With her departure, the people who had once supported her and believed in her family began to question David's actions. Friends and family began to see him for what he truly was, a man who had thrown away everything for an affair that had not only destroyed his marriage but also hurt his children. Sophia, too, was exposed for her role in it all. She was no longer the innocent, sweet housemaid. She was the woman who had driven a wedge between a family, manipulated a vulnerable man, and ultimately, ruined lives. Emily, though far removed from the mess, could feel the shifting tide. She had made the right choice, for herself and for her children. David would have to face the consequences of his actions, and Sophia would eventually face the wrath of the people who saw her for what she truly was. Emily didn't need to be part of that reckoning. She had already reclaimed her life. Now, she was focused on her children, on healing, and on building a future that was free from the toxic grasp of betrayal. As she watched David and Sophia struggle with the fallout of their actions, Emily felt a sense of relief. It wasn't revenge, it was the natural consequence of their choices. They had created their own mess, and now they would have to live in it. Emily moved forward, embracing the challenges of single motherhood, knowing that she had the strength to overcome anything that came her way. She focused on her children, on their happiness, and on rebuilding a life that was hers to control. The scars of betrayal would remain, but they would not define her. Her journey had been painful, but it had also been empowering. She was no longer the woman who would sit in silence, who would allow herself to be betrayed and hurt. She was stronger now. She was free. What do you think about Emily's decision? Was it the right move for her, or could there have been another way to handle the situation? And what about David and Sophia? How do you feel about their actions? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your opinions and start a conversation. If you've ever faced betrayal in a relationship, how did you handle it? Let us know your story or advice for others who may be going through something similar. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this.